For 20 years, he'd built his empire on the simple principle that emotions were expensive luxuries he couldn't afford. Then came Joe Carter, limping into his world with nothing but grit and a gentle way with wild horses. She was a cowgirl who'd been broken by a bronc and put herself back together with quiet determination. When she asked for work, Cash saw only another hired hand. When she settled his most vicious mare with whispered words and patient hands, he saw something that unsettled him. But could a woman who walked with a crooked gait really straighten the twisted paths of a man's hardened heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind cut across the Wyoming range like a blade, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of early snow. Cash Mercer stood on the porch of his ranch house, pulling his grandfather's silver pocket watch from his vest, a ritual he performed every morning at precisely 6 o'clock. The timepiece had belonged to 3 generations of Mercer men, each harder than the last, each more successful at building walls around their hearts than the previous. The watch face reflected the pale morning light, its steady tick marking another day in a life, measured by profit margins and property lines. The Mercer Ranch stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. 20,000 acres of prime grazing, land that Cash had expanded year by year through shrewd bargaining and ruthless business sense. Folks in town said he could smell a good deal from 50 miles away and squeeze water from a stone if there was profit in it. They also said he'd never met a man he couldn't intimidate or a woman he couldn't ignore. At 38, Cash had built an empire on the fundamental belief that sentiment was the enemy of success. The ranch house itself stood as a monument to his philosophy, functional, imposing, and cold. Built from Wyoming granite and local timber, it commanded the valley with the authority of a fortress. Inside, the rooms echoed with emptiness. No family portraits graced the walls. No personal touches softened the harsh angles of furniture chosen for durability rather than comfort. Even the kitchen, spacious enough to feed a dozen men, felt hollow when Cash ate his solitary meals by Lamplight. His foreman, Tom Bradley, had worked the ranch for 15 years and still addressed him as Mr. Mercer, with the careful respect reserved for dangerous animals. The other hands, a rotating crew of drifters and seasonal workers, knew better than to engage in conversation beyond what the work required. Cash paid fair wages, demanded excellence, and offered nothing resembling friendship in return. It was a system that had served him well, keeping complications at bay and his focus sharp on what mattered: building the largest cattle operation in the territory. This particular morning held the promise of the county roundup, an annual gathering where ranchers from across the region brought their herds to sort, brand, and trade. For Cash, it represented opportunity wrapped in the familiar ritual of business. He'd attend not for the social aspects, the shared meals and evening songs around the fire, but to assess the competition, identify prime breeding stock, and remind everyone why the Mercer brand commanded respect out as the sun climbed higher. Painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber, Cash made his way to the corral where his prize horses waited. These were animals bred for endurance and intelligence, each one worth more than most men earned in a year. He ran his operation with the precision of a military campaign, every detail planned and executed with cold efficiency. The county seat of Laramie lay 20 miles south, but the roundup took place in the vast meadows of Sweetwater Valley, neutral, ground where territorial disputes and personal grudges were temporarily set aside in favor of commerce. Cash had attended every roundup for the past decade, his presence both welcomed for the business he brought and feared for the deals he invariably struck in his favor. By mid-morning, Cash and his crew were riding towards Sweetwater Valley, their horses' hooves raising dust clouds that caught the slanted sunlight. The landscape rolled away in gentle swells, covered with buffalo grass and dotted with cottonwoods. already turning yellow with the changing season. It was country that could break a man's spirit or forge it into something harder than steel, depending on his character and circumstances. The roundup was already in full swing when they arrived, with hundreds of cattle milling in temporary pens and riders working to separate the various brands. The air rang with the sound of lowing cattle, shouted commands, and the crack of ropes against leather. Dust hung thick in the autumn air, mixed with the scent of horses, cattle, and wood smoke from the cooking fires. Cash, dismounted near the main corral, his presence immediately noted by the other ranchers. Conversations quieted as he passed, not from hostility, but from the wariness that successful men inspire in their competitors. He moved through the crowd with purpose, his pale gray eyes assessing everything and everyone with the calculating gaze of a predator. It was then, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, that he noticed the commotion near the eastern pen. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be a horse-breaking demonstration, though the usual whoops and cheers were absent. Instead, there was something almost reverent in the way people watched, their voices hushed with the kind of respect reserved for witnessing something extraordinary. Cash found himself drawn toward the gathering, his curiosity piqued despite his usual indifference to such displays. As he pushed through the crowd, he caught sight of the rider at the center of attention, a lean figure in worn leather chaps and a wide-brimmed hat, moving with deliberate, careful steps around a magnificent black mare that should have been impossible to approach. The horse was one he recognized, a wild Mustang that had been captured 2 seasons ago and had broken 3 experienced bronc riders in as many attempts. No one had been able to get close enough to her for a proper breaking, and most had written her off as too dangerous to be worth the effort. Yet here she stood, trembling but still, while the mysterious rider spoke to her in low, melodic tones that seemed to bypass the animal's fear and speak directly to something deeper. The rider's movements were careful and measured, each step planned to avoid startling the mare. There was something different about this person's approach, not the aggressive dominance that most horse breakers employed, but a patient, almost gentle persistence that seemed to acknowledge the animal's fear while refusing to be intimidated by it. As Cash watched, transfixed despite himself, the rider slowly extended a weathered hand toward the mare's muzzle. The crowd held its collective breath as the horse's nostrils flared, testing the scent of this strange human who didn't smell of fear or anger. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with a soft whicker that sounded almost like a sigh, the mare allowed the touch. It was then that the rider turned slightly, and Cash caught sight of the face, beneath the hat brim unmistakably feminine, with high cheekbones weathered by sun and wind, and eyes the color of sage honey. More striking still was the careful way she moved, favoring her left leg with the practiced compensation of someone who had learned to work around a permanent injury. This was Jo Carter, though Cash didn't yet know her name. What he knew, with the instinctive recognition that had made him successful in business, was that he was witnessing something rare, a person who possessed a gift that couldn't be bought, taught, or intimidated into existence. The mare that had injured 3 of his own men was responding to this limping stranger with something approaching trust. As if sensing his scrutiny, Jo looked up and met his gaze across the corral. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of ordinary time, they studied each other with the careful assessment of 2 people recognizing something unexpected. Then Jo turned her attention back to the mare, and the spell was broken. But something had shifted in that moment of recognition, something that Cash couldn't quite name or dismiss. For 20 years, he had built his life on the principle that everything and everyone had a price. That sentiment was weakness, and that emotional distance was the key to success. Yet as he watched this unknown woman work with his untamable horse, he felt the first hairline crack in the ice around his heart. The crowd began to disperse as other activities demanded attention, but Cash remained, transfixed by the quiet drama unfolding before him. Joe had managed to slip a halter over the mare's head, an accomplishment that had defeated far more experienced handlers. More remarkable still was the way the horse seemed to relax under her touch, as if recognizing in this gentle stranger a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to carry unseen wounds. As the sun continued its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Cash found himself asking questions he hadn't considered in years. What made someone capable of reaching past fear to find trust? How did a person learn to transform what appeared to be weakness into a different kind of strength? And why did watching this limping cowgirl work with his horse feel like witnessing something that would change everything he thought he knew about the world? The answers would come, though not in ways he could anticipate. For now, he simply stood and watched as Joe Carter continued her patient work, unaware that she had just walked into the carefully ordered world of Wyoming's most successful and emotionally guarded rancher. The autumn wind carried the sound of her voice across the corral, soft, steady, and strangely comforting, as she spoke to the mare in tones that seemed to promise safety in a world full of dangers. In his vest pocket, his grandfather's silver watch continued its steady tick, marking the passage of moments that Cash sensed might prove more significant than any business deal he had ever made. The weight of 3 generations of Mercermen pressed against his chest, reminding him of the legacy of emotional isolation he had inherited and perfected. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself wondering what it might cost and what it might be worth to let someone pass the walls he had spent a lifetime building. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting the grass silver and the promise of a perfect day for cattle work. Cash arrived at the roundup grounds earlier than usual, though he told himself it was simply good business practice. The truth that he was hoping to see the mysterious woman work with horses again was something he refused to acknowledge, even to himself. Joe Carter was already at the eastern corral, her movements deliberate and careful as she prepared for another session with the black mare. In the early light, Cash could see her more clearly. The weathered hands that spoke of years of hard work, the way she favored her left leg without making it seem like a weakness, and the quiet confidence that radiated from her despite her obvious physical limitations. The mare stood in the center of the corral, no longer the wild, untouchable creature of yesterday. The broken halter that had once symbolized her untamable nature now lay discarded in the dust, replaced by a proper leather headstall that she wore with surprising grace. Cash approached the fence, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. "Mornin'," Joe said without turning around, her voice carrying the soft drawl of someone raised in ranch country. "Figured you'd be back. Man doesn't look at a horse the way you looked at this one yesterday without having some personal interest." Cash leaned against the fence rail, studying both horse and rider with the calculating gaze that had served him well in business. "That's my mare. Bought her 2 seasons ago. She's put 3 men in the doctor's care and 1 in the ground." Joe's hands never paused in their gentle stroking of the mare's neck. "Horse doesn't get that scared without good reason. Someone hurt her bad before you got her. Takes time to convince an animal that not all humans are the enemy." There was something in her tone that suggested she spoke from experience, and Cash found himself wondering what had taught her such patience with damaged creatures. He watched as she moved around the horse, her injured leg creating a slight hitch in her gait that she'd clearly learned to accommodate without complaint. "You have a name?" he asked, though he'd already heard others call her Joe. "Josephine Carter. Most folks call me Joe." She paused in her work, turning to face him fully for the first time. "And you'd be Cash Mercer. Heard plenty about you. None of it good, I'd wager." Joe's smile was small but genuine. "Heard you're fair in your dealings, even if you drive a hard bargain. That's more than most folks can say about the men who run big operations." Cash found himself surprised by her directness. Most people either feared him or wanted something from him, But Joe seemed to regard him with the same calm assessment she'd shown the Mare. "What's your story, Miss Carter?" "Don't see many women working the roundup circuit. Don't see many women who can afford to pass up honest work," she replied, turning back to the horse. "My brother Billy and I have been working ranches since our pa died 3 years back. I'm good with horses, and Billy's got a hand with cattle. We make do." There was no self-pity in her voice, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd learned to work with the hand life had dealt her. Cash respected that, even as he found himself curious about the circumstances that had brought her to this point. "That leg give you much trouble?" he asked, and immediately regretted the personal question. It wasn't like him to pry into someone's private affairs. Joe's laugh was soft and without bitterness. "Bronc named Devil's Dream threw me 2 winters back, landed wrong and broke it in 3 places. Doc said I'd probably never walk right again. Might not walk at all. Proved him wrong on both counts, though I'll admit the walking art took some figuring out." She demonstrated by taking a few steps, her gait uneven but determined. The Mare followed her movement, clearly comfortable with the rhythm of her handler's careful steps. Cash watched the interaction with growing fascination, recognizing something in the way woman and horse moved together, both carrying invisible wounds, but refusing to let them define their limitations. "You looking for work?" The question came out before Cash could stop himself. Surprising them both, Joe paused, her hand resting on the Mare's neck. "Depends on what kind of work. I don't take charity, Mr. Mercer. Never have, never will. Wouldn't offer it. I need someone who can work with difficult horses. Pays $30 a month, plus room and board." It was a generous offer, more than most ranch hands earned, and they both knew it. Joe's eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face for the catch she was certain must exist. "What's the real reason you're offering?" she asked. "Man like you doesn't hire someone just because they can gentle one horse." Cash found himself appreciating her directness, even as it made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to people seeing through his motivations so clearly. "That Mare's worth more than most men. Make in 5 years. She's got bloodlines that could improve my entire herd, but she's useless if she can't be handled. You've done something in 2 days that my best men couldn't do in 2 seasons." Joe considered this, her gaze moving between Cash and the Mare. "I don't need your money, Mr. Mercer. What I need is grazing rights for 2 calves. They belonged to my brother's girl before she died of the fever last spring. Billy's been trying to keep them fed, but we don't have the land." The request surprised Cash. In his experience, everyone wanted money. Land use was more valuable than cash, representing long-term investment rather than immediate gratification. It suggested that Joe Carter was thinking beyond the next paycheck. 2 calves for $30 a month seems like a poor trade," he said carefully. "Not if those calves grow into breeding stock. Billy's got an eye for cattle, and these 2 are from good lines. Given proper grazing, they could be worth more than 3 years' wages in a few seasons." Cash studied her face, seeing the intelligence behind her request. She wasn't just asking for charity, she was proposing a partnership, albeit a small one. It was the kind of long-term thinking he respected, even if it came from someone he'd known for less than 24 hours. "All right," he said finally. "Room and board, plus grazing rights for 2 head of cattle. But I want results. That Mare needs to be saddle broken and ready for breeding within the month." Joe's smile was swift and genuine, transforming her weathered features. "You'll have her ready, Mr. Mercer. I guarantee it." They shook hands across the fence rail, her grip firm and calloused from years of hard work. Cash found himself noting the strength in her handshake, the way she met his eyes directly, without flinching from his reputation for ruthless dealing as he walked away from the corral. Cash couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a decision that would change more than his horse-breaking program. The broken halter lying in the dust seemed to mock his usual careful planning, suggesting that some things couldn't be controlled or predicted. Only experience dot behind him. Joe's voice rose in a soft melody as she continued working with the mare, the sound carrying on the autumn air like a promise of gentleness in a world too often harsh. For the first time in years, Cash found himself looking forward to returning to his ranch, curious to see what other surprises this limping cowgirl might bring to his carefully ordered world. The mare whickered softly, and Joe's answering laugh followed Cash as he walked toward his own horses, the sound somehow managing to find its way past defenses he thought were impenetrable. Change was coming to the Mercer Ranch, whether he was ready for it or not. 3 days later, Joe Carter arrived at the Mercer Ranch with her few possessions loaded in a weathered wagon pulled by a sturdy bay gelding. Beside her sat a young man who couldn't have been more than 19, his face bearing the same strong features as his sister, but softened by youth and an openness that suggested he hadn't yet learned to guard his emotions as carefully as Joe had. "This is my brother Billy," Joe said as she climbed down from the wagon, her movements careful but determined. "Billy, this is Mr. Mercer." Billy Carter stood with the eager awkwardness of young manhood, extending his hand with the kind of earnest respect that reminded Cash uncomfortably of his own youth. "Pleased to meet you, sir. Joe's told me about your mare. I'm looking forward to seeing her work." Cash shook the offered hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and the way Billy's eyes lit up when he talked about horses. "Your sister says you have a way with cattle." "Yes, sir. Been working with them since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Our pay always said cattle were easier to understand than people. They tell you straight what they need and don't try to hide." Bearing tensions. As they unloaded the wagon, Cash noticed the careful way Joe organized their few belongings. Everything had its place and purpose, worn but well-maintained tools, a small collection of books wrapped in oilcloth, and a wooden crate that Billy handled with particular care. "What's in the box?" Cash asked, his curiosity overcoming his usual reserve. Billy's face lit up with pride. "Pa's Bible and some of Ma's things. Joe says it's important to keep family close, even when they're gone." He opened the crate carefully, revealing a leather-bound Bible with pages worn soft from use, a small silver locket, and a faded photograph of a couple standing beside a modest ranch house. Joe took the Bible from her brother's hands, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover with obvious affection. "Pa read from this every evening after supper. Said it helped him remember that there was more to life than the daily struggle of keeping body and soul together." Cash watched the exchange with growing fascination. The Carter siblings moved around each other with the easy familiarity of people who had learned to depend on each other completely. There was no jealousy or competition between them, just the solid foundation of shared hardship and mutual respect. "I've prepared the small cabin behind the main house," Cash said, indicating a neat structure that had once housed his ranch foreman. "It's not much, but it's clean and private." Joe examined the cabin with the practical eye of someone accustomed to making the best of limited resources. The single room was spartanly furnished but well built, with a stone fireplace, a small table, and 2 narrow beds. Someone had left clean linens and a few basic supplies. "This is more than adequate, Mr. Mercer. Thank you." Joe set the Bible on the small table near the window, where the morning light would fall across its pages. "Billy and I are used to making do with less." Over the following days, Cash found himself paying more attention to the daily operations of his ranch than he had in years. He told himself it was simply good business practice to observe his new employee, but the truth was more complicated. Joe Carter had brought something to the Mercer Ranch that he couldn't quite define, a sense of purpose that went beyond the mere accumulation of wealth. She worked with his horses from dawn until dusk, her patient methods gradually transforming even the most difficult animals. The black mare that had seemed untouchable just days before now followed Joe around the corral like a devoted dog, responding to voice commands and gentle touches with an eagerness that amazed everyone who witnessed it. But it wasn't just her skill with horses that captured Cash's attention. It was the way she moved through the ranch, treating every task with the same careful attention she gave to her work with the animals. She mended fences with the same patience she showed in gentling colts, hummed soft melodies while cleaning stalls, and somehow managed to make even the most mundane chores seem like acts of devotion rather than drudgery. Billy proved equally valuable, though in different ways. He had an instinctive understanding of cattle that impressed even Cash's most experienced hands. More importantly, he brought a youthful enthusiasm to the work that seemed to lift the spirits of everyone around him. The other ranch hands, initially skeptical of the newcomers, began to accept the Carter siblings as part of the operation. "That boy's got a gift," Tom Bradley told Cash one evening as they watched Billy work with a small herd of yearlings. "Reminds me of my own son at that age. Before." He stopped abruptly, remembering that Cash didn't encourage personal revelations. Cash nodded, though he found himself curious about the story Tom had started to tell. It occurred to him that he knew very little about the personal lives of his employees, having deliberately maintained the kind of professional distance that discouraged such sharing. Each evening, Joe would sit on the small porch of their cabin, carefully massaging her injured leg with liniment she made from herbs she'd gathered around the ranch. Cash often found himself watching from his own porch, struck by the quiet dignity with which she dealt with her physical limitations. She never complained, never sought sympathy, but simply did what was necessary to maintain her ability to work. One evening, as the autumn air grew crisp with the promise of winter, Cash found himself walking toward the small cabin. Joe was sitting on the porch steps, her leg propped up on a wooden crate, working the liniment into her muscles with practiced efficiency. Billy sat beside her, reading aloud from their father's Bible by the light of a kerosene lamp. "Evening," Cash said, feeling oddly formal despite the casual setting. "Evening, Mr. Mercer," Joe replied, not pausing in her treatment. Billy was just reading from Ecclesiastes. "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." Billy looked up from the Bible, his young face serious in the lamplight. Pa always said that verse helped him remember that bad times don't last forever, but neither do good times. Best to appreciate what you have while you have it. Cash found himself drawn into the peaceful circle of light, settling onto the porch steps without quite knowing why. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Joe said simply. "Lost the ranch to a bad winter and worse decisions, but he never lost his faith that things would work out somehow. Even when he was dying, he told Billy and me that everything happens for a reason, even if we can't see it at the time." There was no bitterness in her voice, just the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned to find meaning in hardship. Cash thought of his own father, who had died angry and alone, surrounded by wealth, but empty of the kind of peace that seemed to sustain the Carter siblings. "What do you think he'd say about your situation now?" Cash asked, surprised by his own curiosity about the answer. Joe smiled, her expression soft in the lamplight. "I think he'd say that Billy and I are exactly where we need to be, doing exactly what we're meant to do. He always believed that God doesn't give us more than we can handle, just more than we think we can handle." Billy closed the Bible and stretched, his movements those of a young man who had put in a full day's honest work. "I'm going to check on those calves one more time before bed. Good night, Mr. Mercer." After Billy disappeared into the darkness, Cash found himself alone with Joe for the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the soft sounds of the ranch settling into night. "Your brother seems like a good young man," Cash said finally. "He is. Better than he knows, I think. Billy's got a generous heart, sometimes too generous for his own good. He'd give away his last dollar to help someone in need. And you?" Cash asked, "What would you give away?" Joe considered the question seriously, her hand still working the liniment into her aching leg. Whatever it took to keep Billy safe and happy. He's all the family I have left, and he's got his whole life ahead of him. I'd do anything to make sure he gets the chance to live it. Cash heard the fierce protectiveness in her voice and recognized something of himself in it. He'd built his empire partly to honor his family's memory, but also to ensure that he would never be vulnerable to the kind of losses that had defined his childhood. That's a heavy burden to carry, he said quietly. Not a burden, Joe replied. A privilege. Billy's got dreams bigger than this ranch, bigger than Wyoming territory. He wants to raise cattle on his own land someday, build something that'll last. I want to help him do that. Cash studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the determination that had carried her through injury and hardship. And what about your dreams? Joe's smile was small but genuine. Right now, my dream is seeing that black Maori of yours ready for breeding season. Tomorrow, it'll be something else. I've learned to keep my dreams small and practical. Makes them easier to achieve. As Cash walked back to his own house, he found himself thinking about dreams, his own and others. For 20 years, his dreams had been measured in acres and dollars, in the expansion of his holdings and the growth of his reputation. But listening to Joe talk about her brother's future, he realized that his dreams had become hollow things, impressive in scope, but empty of the kind of meaning that seemed to drive the Carter siblings. The night air carried the sound of Joe's voice as she spoke softly to the horses in the nearby corral, her words indistinct but somehow comforting. Cash paused at his own door, reluctant to enter the cold emptiness of his house. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering what it would be like to have someone to share his evenings with, someone who could find meaning in simple moments and joy in honest work. Inside his vest pocket, his grandfather's watch ticked steadily, marking the passage of time with mechanical precision. But somehow, the sound no longer seemed quite as cold or lonely as it had before Joe Carter had arrived at his ranch. The memory came to Cash unbidden as he stood in the doorway of his ranch house, watching Joe work with the horses in the morning light. He was 8 years old again, standing in the same doorway, watching his mother rock his newborn sister in the chair that now sat abandoned in the corner of the parlor, covered in dust and neglect. Margaret Mercer had been a woman of gentle strength, much like Joe in some ways, though Cash had never made that connection until now. She had possessed the same quiet competence, the same ability to find joy in simple tasks. The rocking chair had been her sanctuary, where she'd nursed babies, mended clothes, and hummed the same soft melodies that he sometimes heard from Joe as she worked with the horses. The chair had been silent for 18 years now. Ever since, consumption had taken his mother and baby sister within a week of each other. His father had ordered it moved to the parlor, where it served as a reminder of loss rather than comfort. Cash had been forbidden to touch it, told that it was too precious for everyday use. Now, looking at it gathering dust in the morning light, he wondered if his father had been wrong about many things. Cash forced himself to turn away from the memories and focus on the present. Joe was working with a young stallion today, a spirited bay that had been giving the ranch hands trouble. The horse danced and pranced at the end of the lead rope, his eyes rolling white with nervous energy. But Joe's voice remained calm and steady, her movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Easy, boy," she murmured, allowing the stallion to move in wide circles around her. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Just need to remember how to trust." Cash found himself drawn to the corral, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The stallion snorted and shied away from his approach, but Joe made a subtle gesture with her hand that seemed to communicate something to the animal. The horse settled slightly, though his ears remained pricked forward in alert attention. "He's got good lines," Joe said, without taking her eyes off the stallion. "Someone spent time with him when he was young. You can see it in the way he moves." But something happened to make him afraid of men. Cash studied the horse with new interest. He'd bought the stallion from a ranch in Colorado, along with several other animals, without paying much attention to individual histories. To him, they were investments, valuable for their breeding potential and little else. "Can you fix him?" he asked. "Depends on what you mean by fix," Joe replied, allowing the stallion to come a few steps closer. "If you mean make him forget whatever, hurt him, then no. But if you mean help him learn to trust again, then yes. Time and patience can heal most wounds if you're willing to invest both." There was something in her tone that suggested she spoke from experience, and Cash found himself wondering what wounds she was still healing. The limp was obvious, but he sensed there were deeper injuries that she carried with the same quiet dignity. Billy appeared from the direction of the cattle pens, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Mercer, you should see those 2 calves. They're growing like weeds, and the way they move, I think they're going to be something special." Cash followed Billy to the pasture where the Carter calves grazed alongside some of his own young stock. The animals Joe had requested grazing rights for were indeed impressive specimens. Heifer, and a young bull with the kind of bone structure and muscle definition that promised excellent breeding potential. "Your sister made a good bargain," Cash admitted, watching the way the calves moved with natural grace and confidence. Billy's grin was infectious. "Joe's got an eye for quality, whether it's horses or cattle. Pa always said she could spot a good animal from a mile away." His expression grew more serious. "I know some folks think it's strange, her working with horses the way she does. But she's got a gift for understanding what an animal needs." "What about you?" Cash asked. "What's your gift?" Billy considered the question seriously, his gaze moving over the cattle with obvious affection. "I can see what they could become, not just what they are. That heifer there, she's going to throw calves that'll be the talk of the territory in a few years. And the bull, he's got the temperament to improve any herd he's bred to." Cash found himself impressed by the young man's confidence and vision. At 19, Billy Carter had the kind of long-term thinking that took most ranchers decades to develop. "You planning to stay in the cattle business?" "Yes, sir. Hope to have my own place someday, raise the kind of stock that'll make a difference." Billy's expression grew wistful. "Pi always said that a man's legacy isn't measured in how much he accumulates, but in how much he improves what he touches." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the direction of the house. Cash turned to see his foreman, Tom Bradley, approaching with 2 of the ranch hands. Their expressions were grim, and Cash immediately knew something was wrong. "Mr. Mercer," Tom said, his voice tight with concern, "we've got trouble brewing in town. Word is that the Jameson brothers are stirring up sentiment against hiring women for ranch work. They're saying it's not natural, that it'll bring bad luck to the whole territory." Cash felt his jaw tighten. The Jameson brothers ran a smaller operation to the east and had always resented his success. "What kind of trouble are we talking about?" "They're organizing some of the other ranchers, trying to get them to refuse to do business with anyone who employs women in men's work. They're claiming it's about tradition and respectability, but I think it's more about finding ways to undermine your operation." Billy's face had gone pale during Tom's report. "Mr. Mercer, if we're causing problems for you, you're not causing anything," Cash interrupted, his voice carrying the cold authority that had made him successful in business. "The Jameson brothers have been looking for reasons to challenge me for years. If it wasn't this, it would be something else." But even as he spoke the words, Cash found himself assessing the situation with the calculating mind that had guided his business decisions for 20 years. Employing Joe and Billy was a calculated risk, and now that risk was beginning to show potential consequences, he could easily solve the problem by releasing them from their employment, finding some excuse that would allow him to maintain his reputation while avoiding conflict. Joe appeared at his elbow. having approached so quietly that none of them had noticed her arrival. "What's the discussion about?" she asked, her voice calm despite the tension she must have sensed. Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to repeat the news in front of her. Cash found himself studying Joe's face, looking for signs of the fear or anger that most people would feel when threatened. Instead, he saw only the same quiet competence that she brought to everything else. "The Jameson brothers are trying to make trouble about me working here," she said, correctly interpreting their silence. "They think a woman handling horses is somehow going to bring down the moral fabric of the territory." "Something like that," Cash admitted. Joe nodded, as if she'd expected this development. "Mr. Mercer, I appreciate the work you've given Billy and me, but I won't have our presence here damage your business. If you need us to move on, no." The word came out more forcefully than Cash had intended, surprising everyone, including himself. "You're doing good work here, and I don't make business decisions based on what the Jameson brothers think is proper." Billy looked between his sister and Cash, clearly torn between gratitude and concern for the complications their presence was causing. "Maybe we could find work somewhere else, somewhere that wouldn't cause problems." "There is no somewhere else," Joe said quietly. "This is the same conversation we'd have at any ranch in the territory. Some men don't think women should do anything beyond cooking and sewing." Cash found himself studying Joe's face, seeing the resignation there, but also the quiet determination that had impressed him from their first meeting. She wasn't asking for special treatment or expecting him to fight her battles for her. She was simply stating facts with the same calm acceptance she'd shown in dealing with her injury. "The Jameson brothers can go to hell," Cash said finally, his voice carrying the kind of finality that ended discussions. "You're both employed here as long as you want to be. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." Tom Bradley nodded approvingly, but Cash could see the concern in his foreman's eyes. This decision would have consequences, and they both knew it. In the complex social and economic network of territorial Wyoming, taking a stand like this meant choosing sides in a conflict that could affect everything from cattle prices to access to winter feed. As the group dispersed, Cash found himself alone with Joe again. She was studying his face with the same careful attention she gave to evaluating horses, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing more than he intended to reveal. "Why?" she asked simply. Cash considered the question, realizing that he didn't have a simple answer. The smart business decision would have been to avoid the conflict, to find a face-saving way to release the Carter siblings and maintain his position in the community. But something about Joe's quiet dignity and Billy's earnest enthusiasm had made that option impossible to consider. "Because you're good at what you do," he said finally. "And because I've spent 20 years building this ranch by making decisions based on what works, not what's popular." Joe smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features. "That's a good answer, Mr. Mercer. I hope you still feel that way when the Jameson brothers start making real trouble." As she walked away, Cash found himself thinking about the rocking chair in his parlor, about the memories it held and the dust it had gathered. His mother had faced her own share of criticism from neighbors who thought she was too independent, too willing to speak her mind. His father had defended her then, though Cash had been too young to understand the courage that had required. Now, watching Joe limp toward the corral where the stallion waited for his next lesson in trust, Cash wondered if he had inherited more from his parents than he'd realized. The capacity for loyalty, for taking stands on principle rather than convenience, seemed to be awakening in him. After years of dormancy. The autumn wind carried the sound of Joe's voice as she spoke to the stallion, her words patient and encouraging. Cash listened to the melody of her voice and felt something shift inside him, like ice beginning to crack under the pressure of a spring thaw. Change was coming, whether he was ready for it or not, and for the first time in years, he found himself curious about what that change might bring. The first snow came early that year, dusting the rangeland with white and sending cattle huddling together in sheltered draws. Cash stood at his kitchen window, watching Joe work with the horses, despite the bitter wind that cut across the valley. Like a blade, she moved with her usual careful determination, her breath visible in small puffs. As she spoke softly to a young mare that had been giving the ranch hands trouble. It had been 2 weeks since the confrontation with the Jameson brothers had moved beyond idle threats to real consequences. 3 ranchers had canceled orders for breeding stock, citing concerns about business practices. The feed store in town had started charging Cash higher prices, claiming increased transportation costs that seemed to apply only to the Mercer ranch. Most telling of all, 2 of his best seasonal hands had failed to return for the winter work, leaving him short-handed at the worst possible time. Joe had said nothing about the situation, but Cash could see the weight of responsibility in the careful way she moved, the extra hour she put in each day, as if she could somehow make up for the problems her presence had caused. Billy had grown quieter too, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by the realization that his dreams might be costing his employer more than anyone had anticipated. The kitchen door opened behind Cash, letting in a blast of cold air along with Tom Bradley. The foreman stamped snow from his boots, his weathered face grim with the kind of news that Cash had been expecting. "Jake Morrison won't be delivering hay this winter," Tom said without preamble. "Claims he's got orders from bigger operations that need all his supply." Cash turned from the window, his expression carefully neutral. Jake Morrison had been delivering winter feed to the Mercer Ranch for 8 years, and his sudden change of heart could only mean one thing. The pressure campaign was working. What about the Henderson place? Same story. Seems like everyone's got prior commitments all of a sudden. Tom pulled off his gloves, his movements sharp with frustration. "We've got enough feed stored to last through December, maybe into January if we're careful." After that, Cash nodded, his mind already working through the implications. Without adequate winter feed, he'd be forced to sell off a significant portion of his herd at distressed prices, potentially crippling the ranch's financial position for years to come. It was exactly the kind of pressure the Jameson brothers had been hoping to apply. "There might be another option," Tom said reluctantly. "I heard talk that if you were to reconsider certain staffing decisions, some of these supply problems might resolve themselves." The suggestion hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly understood. Fire Joe and Billy Carter, and the economic pressure would disappear. It was a simple solution to a complex problem, the kind of pragmatic decision that had guided Cash's business practices for 20 years. "I'll think about it," Cash said finally, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. After Tom left, Cash found himself walking toward the small cabin where the Carter siblings lived. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows, creating a scene of domestic comfort that seemed at odds with the harsh realities pressing down on all of them. He knocked on the door, feeling oddly formal, despite the casual nature of ranch life. Billy answered, his young face brightening at the sight of his employer. "Mr. Mercer, coming out of the cold. Joe's just making coffee." The interior of the cabin was modest but welcoming, transformed by small touches that spoke of people who knew how to make a home anywhere. Joe's father's Bible sat open on the table, surrounded by wildflowers that Billy had pressed between the pages. A quilt that must have belonged to their mother covered one of the narrow beds, its colors faded, but still beautiful in the lamplight. Joe looked up from the stove, her expression immediately alert to the tension she must have seen in his face. "Evening, Mr. Mercer. You look like a man with something on his mind." Cash accepted the offered coffee, grateful for the warmth of the cup in his cold hands. "We need to talk about the situation with the other ranchers." Billy's face fell, and Joe's expression grew carefully neutral. Neither of them seemed surprised by the conversation, which told Cash they'd been expecting this moment since the pressure campaign had begun. "The feed situation is becoming critical," Cash continued. "If I can't secure winter supplies, I'll have to sell off most of the herd, at whatever prices I can get." "How much time do we have?" Joe asked quietly. "A month, maybe 6 weeks if we're lucky." Cash studied their faces, seeing acceptance rather than panic. "There's a solution, but it's not one I'm comfortable with." Billy started to speak, but Joe silenced him with a gentle touch on his arm. "You're saying that if Billy and I move on, your supply problems will disappear." Cash nodded, hating the necessity of the conversation, but respecting their right to understand the full situation. "It's not what I want, but it might be what's necessary to save the ranch." Joe stood and walked to the window, her limp more pronounced than usual a sign. Cash had learned that she was in pain or under stress. When she turned back to face him, her expression was resolved, but not bitter. "Mr. Mercer, Billy and I knew this day might come. We've talked about it." She returned to her chair, her movements careful and deliberate. "We won't be responsible for destroying what you've spent 20 years building." "Joe, no," Billy started, but she cut him off with a look. "Billy, this isn't about what we want. It's about what's right." She turned back to Cash, her sage-colored eyes steady and clear. "We'll pack up and be gone by morning. No hard feelings, no looking back." Cash felt something twist in his chest at her matter-of-fact acceptance. He'd expected argument, pleading, or at least some display of the fear that most people would feel when facing unemployment in the middle of winter. Instead, Joe Carter was handling this crisis with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else. "Where will you go?" he found himself asking. "There's always work somewhere for people willing to do it," Joe replied. "Billy's got skills that any ranch would value, and I can find something, even if it's not working with horses." Billy's jaw was tight with the effort of controlling his emotions. "The calves will stay here," Joe finished. "They're thriving, and Mr. Mercer will see that they get the care they need." She looked at Cash with something that might have been gratitude. "You gave us a chance when others wouldn't. That means something." Cash stood abruptly, his coffee forgotten. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too warm, too full of the kind of selfless grace that made his business calculations seem cold and soulless. "I haven't made any decisions yet." "But you will," Joe said gently. "And when you do, you'll make the right one." "You're a good man, Cash Mercer, even if you've spent so many years convincing yourself otherwise that you've almost started to believe it." The use of his first name startled him almost as much as her assessment of his character. In the lamplight, with her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee cup and her hair escaping from its practical braid, Joe looked like someone who belonged in this warm circle of light, who understood things about home and family that he'd forgotten. How to value outside. The wind howled across the rangeland, driving snow against the windows and reminding everyone of the harsh realities that waited beyond the cabin's walls. Cash thought about his empty ranch house, about the rocking chair gathering dust in his parlor, about the 20 years he'd spent building walls around his heart. "The deed to our family's ranch," Joe said suddenly, reaching into a wooden box beside her chair. She pulled out a folded document, its edges worn from handling. "Lost it to creditors after my accident, when I couldn't work for 6 months, and Billy was too young to handle everything alone." She handed him the paper, and Cash found himself looking at the legal description of a small but well-situated property about 30 miles south of his own holdings. The Carter family had owned good land, the kind that could support a modest but profitable operation in the right hands. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked. "Because I want you to understand what this job means to us. It's not just about wages or even the calves. It's about hope that maybe Billy and I can work our way back to something like what we lost." Joe's voice was steady, But Cash could hear the emotion beneath the surface. But not at the cost of destroying someone else's dream. Pa taught us that there are some prices too high to pay, even for things we want most. Billy reached for his sister's hand, his young face reflecting a maturity beyond his years. Joe's right, Mr. Mercer. We'll find another way. Cash folded the deed carefully and handed it back to Joe, his mind racing with possibilities that had nothing to do with pragmatic business decisions. What if there was another option? Something that didn't require you to leave, or me to lose. The ranch? I'm listening, Joe said cautiously. The Henderson place borders my property to the south. Old man Henderson died last spring, and his widow's been trying to sell. It's smaller than my operation, but it's got good water rights and decent grazing. Cash found himself speaking faster, the idea taking shape as he voiced it. If someone were to buy it, they could run their own cattle operation, maybe even contract, with larger ranches for specialized services. Billy's eyes lit up with understanding, but Joe's expression remained guarded. Mr. Mercer, we don't have that kind of money. Even if we worked for 10 years, what if you didn't need to buy it outright? What if someone were willing to hold the note, accept payment over time based on the operation's profits? The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and disbelief. Joe studied Cash's face as if trying to read his true intentions. You're talking about a partnership, she said finally. I'm talking about good business, Cash replied, though he knew it was more than that. You've got skills that any operation would value. Billy's got the kind of cattle sense that can't be taught, and frankly, having friendly neighbors who understand the business would be worth more than whatever interest I might make on a conventional loan. Billy was practically vibrating with excitement, but Joe remained cautious. What about the pressure? From the other ranchers? This wouldn't solve that problem. Actually, it might. Cash smiled, feeling more energized than he had in weeks. If you're operating your own ranch, you're not employees anymore. You're business partners. The Jameson brothers would have a harder time organizing a campaign against legitimate competition. Joe was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the deed. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Why would you do this for us? Cash considered the question, knowing that the honest answer was more complex than he was ready to admit. Because sometimes the smart business decision and the right decision turn out to be the same thing. It wasn't the complete truth, but it was all he was prepared to reveal, even to himself. The complete truth involved the way Joe's laugh made his empty house seem less lonely, the way Billy's enthusiasm reminded him of his own dreams at that age, and the way both of them had somehow managed to find their way past defenses he'd thought were impenetrable. The wind continued to howl outside, but inside the small cabin, the atmosphere had changed from resignation to hope. Cash found himself thinking about second chances, about the possibility that some mistakes could be corrected and some losses recovered. We'd need to move carefully, he said, his mind already working through the practical details. Draw up proper contracts, make sure everything's legal and above board. But if you're interested, we're interested, Billy said quickly, then looked at his sister. We are, aren't we, Joe? Joe smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. Yes, Billy, we're very interested. As Cash walked back to his house through the swirling snow, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of a decision made with his heart rather than just his head. The rocking chair waited in his parlor, but for the first time in 18 years, it didn't seem quite so lonely or forgotten. Change was coming to the Wyoming rangeland, and Cash Mercer was finally ready to embrace it. The pressed wildflower fell from between the pages of Billy's journal as he excitedly sketched plans for the Carter Ranch operation. It was a simple prairie rose, its petals now the color of old parchment, but preserved with the care of something precious. Joe picked it up gently, remembering the summer day when Billy had given it to her, still pink with morning dew and sweet with fragrance. For when the hard days come, he'd said with the wisdom of someone far older than his years, so you remember that beautiful things still grow, even in tough ground. Now, sitting at the kitchen table in Cash's ranch house, where they'd been invited to finalize the partnership details, Joe held the flower up to the morning light streaming through the windows. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of legal documents, property surveys, and careful negotiations that would transform their lives forever. Cash looked up from the contracts spread across the table, his pale gray eyes softening as he noticed what she held. Something important? A reminder, Joe said simply, carefully placing the flower back between the journal's pages. Billy gave it to me the summer after our parents died. He was only 16, but he somehow knew I needed hope more than I needed sympathy. Billy glanced up from his sketching, his face flushing slightly. Joe was taking care of everything the ranch, me, trying to keep us afloat. I just wanted her to know that good things still happened, even when everything else was falling apart. Cash studied the young man with growing respect. At 19, Billy Carter possessed an emotional intelligence that many men never developed. More impressive still was the easy affection between the siblings, the way they supported each other, without competition or resentment. The Henderson widow signed the papers yesterday, Cash said, returning to the business at hand. The property's officially available, and she's accepted our offer. You can take possession as soon as the contracts are finalized. Joe reviewed the documents one more time, her finger tracing the legal language that would give them a chance to rebuild their lives. The terms were more generous than she dared hope, a modest down payment that they could manage with their savings, followed by annual payments based on a percentage of the ranch's profits. If the operation failed, they'd lose their investment, but wouldn't be crushed by debt they couldn't repay. It's a fair deal, she said quietly. More than fair. It's good business, Cash replied, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Having experienced, neighbors who understand cattle and horses benefits everyone in the long run. The morning light caught the silver of his grandfather's pocket watch as he consulted it, gesture Joe had noticed he made whenever he was thinking deeply about something. She'd begun to understand that the watch represented more than just timekeeping. For Cash, it was a connection to family history and the weight of expectations that had shaped his careful, guarded approach to life. Billy set down his pencil and looked between his sister and their benefactor with the directness of youth. Mr. Mercer, why are you really doing this? And don't say it's just business. I've been around enough men to know when someone's acting from the heart instead of the head. Cash's jaw tightened slightly, and Joe recognized the expression of a man being pushed to reveal more than he was comfortable sharing. She started to redirect the conversation, but Cash held up a hand to stop her. Your sister reminds me of someone I lost a long time ago, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. My mother had the same way of finding hope in difficult circumstances, the same ability to gentle wild things with patience instead of force. Joe felt her breath catch at the unexpected vulnerability in his admission. She'd sensed grief in Cash from their first meeting, had recognized the careful walls that people built around old wounds. But this was the first time he'd acknowledged the losses that had shaped him. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Joe said gently. She was. She died when I was 15, along with my baby sister. Consumption took them both within a week. Cash's fingers traced the edge of the contract, his gaze distant with memory. My father never recovered from losing them. He taught me that caring too much was dangerous, that the smart man kept his distance from anything that could be taken away. Billy's expression had grown serious with the weight of this revelation. But you don't really believe that, do you? If you did, you wouldn't be helping us. Cash looked at the young man with something approaching surprise. What makes you so sure? Because lonely people don't usually go out of their way to help others build the kind of life they've convinced themselves they can't have, Billy replied, with devastating simplicity. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of Cash's pocket watch and the soft sound of wind against the windows. Jo found herself studying Cash's face, seeing the internal struggle between the isolation he'd cultivated and the connection he clearly craved. Billy's right, she said quietly. You've spent 20 years building walls around your heart, but you keep finding ways to let people pass them. That doesn't sound like a man who's given up on the possibility of caring. Cash stood abruptly, walking to the window where he could look out over the rangeland that had been his entire world for so long. Caring and acting on it are two different things. I learned that lesson a long time ago. Maybe it's time to learn a new lesson, Jo suggested, rising to join him at the window. Billy and we've learned that caring is what gives life meaning, even when it comes with the risk of loss. They stood side by side, watching the horses move across the pasture in the morning light. The black mare that had first brought them together grazed peacefully among the herd, her wild nature now channeled into trust and partnership. Jo thought about the symbolism of that transformation, the way patience and understanding could tame even the most fearful spirits. There's something else, Cash said suddenly, his voice so quiet that Jo had to lean closer to hear him. The rocking chair in my parlor, it was my mother's. I haven't been able to bring myself to sit in it since she died, but I haven't been able to get rid of it either. Jo understood immediately. The chair represented both connection and loss, love and grief, intertwined in a way that made it precious and painful in equal measure. Some things are worth keeping, even when they hurt to look at. I've been thinking about moving it back to the kitchen, where she used to sit in the evenings. Maybe it's time to let it be useful again, instead of just a monument to what's gone. The decision represented more than furniture arrangement, and they both knew it. It was Cash's first tentative step toward reclaiming the parts of himself that grief had frozen, toward allowing warmth back into spaces that had been cold for too long. Billy joined them at the window, his young face bright with enthusiasm despite the serious conversation. When we get our ranch running, you'll have to come visit, Mr. Mercer. Jo makes the best coffee in the territory, and we've got stories that'll make you laugh until your sides hurt. Cash smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features. I'd like that, Billy. I'd like that very much. As they returned to the table to finish signing the contracts, Jo felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with the business arrangement they were concluding. Something was beginning between her and Cash, something that grew stronger each time. He let his guard down enough to reveal the man beneath the careful facade. The pressed wildflower caught the light again as Billy reopened his journal. It's faded. Beauty, a reminder that some things could survive the harshest seasons and still retain their essential grace. Jo thought about hope, about second chances, and about the way two damaged people might help each other heal if they were brave enough to try. Outside, a Wyoming wind carried the promise of winter, but inside the warm kitchen, surrounded by contracts and dreams and the comfortable presence of people who were becoming family, the future seemed bright with possibility. The flower in Billy's journal had weathered storms and cold, but it had endured a perfect metaphor for the kind of love that could grow even in the most unlikely places. Cash's pocket watch chimed softly, marking another hour in what was shaping up to be a day that would change everything. But for once, the steady tick seemed to mark time not as something to be endured, but as something to be treasured, filled with moments that mattered and connections that gave life its true meaning. The contracts were signed with steady hands and hopeful hearts, sealing not just a business partnership, but the beginning of something much more significant. As Jo carefully folded her copy of the documents, she caught Cash watching her with an expression she'd never seen before, gentle, wondering, and full of the kind of possibility that comes when a guarded heart finally begins to open. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous-looking clerk who could barely meet Jo's eyes as he handed over the official document. The paper was crisp and legal, bearing the seal of the territorial court and language. That cut through hope with surgical precision. Billy had 30 days to settle his debts, or lose the 2 calves that represented their entire future about Joe. Read the notice 3 times before the full impact sank in. The debt dated back to their father's final illness, when desperate measures had seemed like the only option. Dr. Samuel Morrison Jake, Morrison's brother and the territory's only trained physician, had demanded payment for months of unsuccessful treatment, charging rates that would have bankrupted families far wealthier than the Carters. How much? Billy asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he looked over her shoulder at the document. $237, Joe replied, the number falling between them like a stone into still water. Plus interest and court costs. It might as well have been $2,000. Even with their savings and the money they'd earned, Immerse Ranch, they had less than $50 to their names. The calves they'd worked so hard to raise would be seized and sold to satisfy the debt, destroying their dreams of rebuilding the family ranch before they'd even begun. Cash found. Them sitting at the table in their cabin an hour later, the foreclosure notice spread between them like an accusation. He took one look at their faces and knew that their carefully laid plans had just been shattered by forces beyond their control. What's happened? He asked, settling into the third chair with the careful movement of someone who had learned to. Expect bad news. Joe handed him the notice without comment, watching his face as he read through the legal language. She saw his jaw tighten with anger, saw the way his fingers pressed against the paper as if he could somehow erase the words through force of will. Sam Morrison, Cash said finally, his voice flat with disgust. I should have expected this. He's been the Jameson brothers' financial partner for years, buying up debts and using them to pressure small ranchers. You think this is connected to the campaign against you? Billy asked, hope flickering in his voice at the possibility that this was something that could be fought. I know it is, Cash replied grimly. Morrison's been holding this debt for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to use it. Your partnership with me gave him the perfect opportunity to destroy your plans and send a message to anyone else who might consider working with the Mercer Ranch. Joe felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. Once again, her decisions had created problems for people she cared about. The limp that had cost them their original ranch, the injury that had made her father desperate, enough to seek expensive medical care, and now the partnership that had made them targets. Every choice seemed to lead to more complications for those around her. There has to be something we can do, Billy said, his young voice carrying the kind of desperate hope that Joe recognized from her own darkest moments. Some way to fight this in court, or negotiate a payment plan. Morrison's not interested in payment plans, Cash interrupted. He wants your calves, and he wants to prove that anyone who associates with me will pay the price. The 3 of them sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down like a physical force. Outside, the first real blizzard of the season was building, dark clouds gathering over the mountains and promising the kind of storm that could trap livestock and test the limits of human endurance. It was then that Cash's expression changed, a look of grim determination replacing the frustrated anger. What if we gave him something bigger than a couple of calves to worry about? What do you mean? Joe asked, recognizing the calculating gleam in his pale gray eyes. Morrison and the Jameson brothers think they're playing a sophisticated game, using economic pressure to force me into submission. But they've made one critical mistake. They've assumed I care more about profit than principle. Cash stood and began pacing the small cabin, his mind clearly working through possibilities. What if we called their bluff in a way they never expected? Billy leaned forward, caught up in Cash's energy despite the dire circumstances. What kind of bluff? The kind that turns their weapon against them. Morrison's been collecting debts all over the territory, using them to control smaller ranchers and force them into disadvantageous deals. But debt collection requires legal standing, and legal standing requires clean hands. Joe began to understand where his thoughts were leading. You think Morrison's business practices might not stand up to scrutiny? I think Sam Morrison has been operating outside the law for years, and everyone's been too afraid or too isolated to challenge him. But if someone with resources and connections were to start asking uncomfortable questions, the plan that emerged over the next hour was audacious in its scope and dangerous in its implications. Rather than fighting the foreclosure directly, Cash proposed to investigate Morrison's entire debt collection operation, looking for evidence of fraud, usury, or other illegal practices that could expose the doctor to criminal charges. It's a risk, Cash admitted as they reviewed their strategy. If we're wrong, or if we can't find enough evidence, you'll lose the calves and I'll have made even more powerful enemies. And if we're right? Joe asked. If we're right, we'll destroy Morrison's ability to use debt as a weapon, potentially, freeing dozens of families from financial slavery. Cash's smile was sharp and cold. Plus, we'll send a message to the Jameson brothers that some fights cost more than they're worth. Billy looked between his sister and their partner, his expression torn between excitement and concern. What about the ranch? Even if we stop Morrison, we'll still need to make the payments to Mrs. Henderson. One problem at a time, Joe said, though her own concern was evident in her voice. First, we need to survive this attack. Then we can worry about building our future. The blizzard struck that evening with the fury of a living thing, driving snow horizontally across the rangeland and dropping temperatures to levels that could kill exposed livestock in minutes. Cash had moved the most vulnerable animals to sheltered areas, but a significant portion of his herd remained in the high pastures of Devil's Gulch, where natural windbreaks provided some protection, but access was treacherous in good weather and nearly impossible in a storm. It was Billy who first noticed the unusual movement in the distance, dark shapes against the white that shouldn't have been there. "Mr. Mercer," he called from the window, "something's wrong with the cattle in the north pasture." Cash joined him at the window, his experienced eye immediately recognizing the signs of panic in the distant herd. The animals were bunching together and moving erratically, behavior that suggested either predator pressure or some other immediate threat. "They're spooked," Cash said grimly. In this weather, that could mean only one thing: wolves. The word sent a chill through all of them. That had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The packs had been growing bolder as winter approached, and a storm like this could drive them to desperation. A panicked herd in a blizzard was vulnerable to being driven over cliffs or into ravines, losses that could cripple even a large operation. Like the Mercer Ranch. "We have to help them," Joe said, already reaching for her coat. "No," Cash replied firmly. "It's too dangerous. We'll lose more lives trying to help than we'll save." But even as he spoke, they could see more cattle joining the panicked movement, dark shapes stumbling through the snow as they fled from whatever was pursuing them. Among them, Joe realized with a start, were the two calves that represented her and Billy's entire future. "Those are our animals out there," Billy said, his voice tight with determination. "If we lose them to wolves, it won't matter what happens with Morrison's foreclosure." Joe looked between her brother and Cash, seeing the conflict in both their faces. The smart choice was to wait out the storm and assess the damage in the morning. The right choice, the one that honored the responsibility they felt toward the animals in their care, was to risk everything in an attempt to save what they could. "I'm going," she said quietly, beginning to gather the gear she'd need for a rescue mission in blizzard conditions. "Billy, you stay here where it's safe." "Like hell," Billy replied, his usually gentle language sharpened by emotion. "We're partners in this, Joe. We face it together." Cash watched them prepare for what could very well be a suicide mission. His. Face a battlefield between practical concerns and the kind of protective instincts he'd thought he'd successfully buried years ago. When Joe struggled with her heavy coat, favoring her injured leg as she tried to balance, something inside him snapped. "We all go," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "But we do this smart, with proper equipment and a plan that gives us a chance of succeeding." As they prepared to venture into the storm, Joe caught sight of herself in the small mirror beside the door. Her reflection showed a woman transformed by determination and purpose, no longer the broken cowgirl who had limped into Cash's life asking for work. Beside her, Billy's young face was set with the kind of resolve that would carry him through whatever challenges lay ahead. And behind them both, Cash Mercer was finally allowing himself to care more about protecting the people he loved than about protecting himself from the possibility of loss. The storm raging outside was nothing compared to the emotional tempest that had been building in his heart. But for the first time in 20 years, he was ready to face both without flinching. The foreclosure notice lay forgotten on the table. As they prepared to brave the blizzard, a reminder that sometimes the biggest threats come not from the forces of nature, but from the calculated cruelty of those who mistake power for strength. But they would face that challenge later if they survived the night. For now, there were animals to save and a bond to prove between three people who had somehow found family in the most unlikely circumstances. The door opened onto a world turned white and wild, and they stepped into it together. Cash's unsigned will lay spread across his desk in the ranch house office, its blank signature line a stark reminder of a life lived in emotional isolation. He'd written and rewritten the document a dozen times over the years, never able to decide who should inherit the empire he'd built from nothing. With no family, no close friends, and no one who truly knew the man behind the reputation, the Mercer Ranch seemed destined to be sold to the highest bidder when his time came. But now, as he gathered the equipment they'd need for the rescue mission, Cash found himself thinking about legacy in terms he'd never considered before. What good was wealth without someone to share it with? What value did land hold if there was no one to care for it with the same passion that had driven him to acquire it? The blizzard hammered against the windows with increasing fury, and the temperature had dropped to levels that could kill an exposed person in minutes. Venturing out in these conditions violated every principle of ranch safety Cash had learned in 30 years of Wyoming winters. But the alternative, watching helplessly as wolves destroyed his herd and the Carter siblings' dreams, was somehow worse than the physical danger they were about to face. "Rope," he said, checking items off, his mental list as he packed supplies. Extra blankets, emergency rations, lanterns, ammunition. Each item represented a small hedge against disaster, though they all knew that preparation could only go so far in conditions like these. Joe appeared in the doorway, bundled in every piece of warm clothing she owned. Her father's worn coat hung loose on her frame, but her eyes were bright with determination. "Billy's bringing the horses around to the lee side of the barn. They're spooked by the wind, but they'll hold together if we keep them moving." Cash nodded, shouldering his pack and checking his rifle one final time. "The wolves will be following the scent trail upwind. If we can get between them and the herd, we might be able to turn the cattle back toward the shelter. And if we can't?" Joe asked quietly. "Then we save what we can and try to survive until morning." Cash met her gaze directly, seeing his own resolve reflected in her sage-colored eyes. "Joe, I need you to know if something happens to me out there, the partnership agreement stands. The ranch will be yours and Billy's, free and clear." Joe's expression sharpened with surprise and something deeper. "Cash, don't talk like that. We're all coming back." "Maybe, but a man should have his affairs in order before he rides into a storm like this." Cash moved to his desk and quickly signed the will, adding a codicil that named the Carter siblings as his primary beneficiaries. 20 years I've been trying to figure out who should inherit what I've built. Turns out the answer was riding toward me in a wagon, asking for work. The sound of Billy calling from outside interrupted their conversation, but Joe lingered in the doorway. Why us, Cash? Really? Cash considered the question, knowing that his answer would reveal more about his feelings than he'd ever intended. To share, because you and Billy understand that land isn't just about ownership, it's about stewardship. You care for things the way they're meant to be cared for. And Joe prompted, sensing there was more to his explanation. And because watching you work with those horses, seeing the way you've never let your injury define your limitations, reminding me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you. They looked at each other across the small space of the office, and Cash felt the walls he'd built around his heart shift and crack. For a moment that stretched. Beyond the boundaries of ordinary time, he saw a future that included more than just business partnerships and shared responsibilities. He saw warmth where there had been coldness, laughter where there had been silence, and the possibility that two damaged people might heal each other if they were brave enough to try. Billy's voice called again, more urgently this time, and the spell was broken. They gathered their gear and headed into the storm, where the real test of their courage and commitment waited. The wind hit them like a physical blow as they left the shelter of the ranch house. Even with their faces wrapped in scars and their bodies bundled in layers of wool and leather, the cold cut through their defenses with merciless efficiency. The horses danced nervously at the ends of their lead ropes, their instincts screaming. Warnings about the folly of venturing out in such conditions. Stay close, Cash shouted over the wind, his voice barely audible, even at arm's length. If we get separated, head back to the ranch. Don't try to search for each other in this. They mounted with difficulty, the horses fighting their riders, intentions every step of the way. But years of training and trust eventually won out, and the small party began making its way toward the distant sounds of cattle in distress. The world had been reduced to a white void where direction became meaningless, and distance impossible to judge. They navigated by instinct and memory, following fence lines when they could find them and trusting their horses. Superior senses when human vision failed completely. It was Billy who heard them first, the low bawling of frightened cattle mixed with the more ominous sounds of predators on the hunt. The wolves' howls carried on the wind, like voices from some primordial nightmare, reminding everyone that civilization was a thin veneer over forces that had ruled this land for millennia. There, Joe called, pointing toward a cluster of dark shapes barely visible through the driving snow. I can see them. What they saw was chaos, given formed dozens of cattle bunched together in panic, while dark shapes circled them like harbingers of death. The wolves had chosen their moment perfectly, using the storm to drive the herd away from shelter and into terrain, where escape would be impossible. Cash's mind raced through tactical possibilities, weighing risks against potential outcomes. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and fighting in conditions that favored their opponents. But retreat meant accepting losses that could destroy everything they'd worked to build. Billy, you circle wide to the left and try to turn the lead. Animals back toward the ranch. Joe, stay with me. We'll push directly into the pack and try to scatter them. Cash checked his rifle and looked at both Carters with grim determination. Whatever happens, don't try to be heroes. One mistake out. Here, and we're all dead. They spurred their horses forward into the maelstrom, and Cash felt something shift inside him as they rode toward almost certain disaster. For 20 years, he protected himself by avoiding risks that couldn't be calculated, by maintaining emotional distance from anything that could be lost. But now, riding beside people he'd grown to love, he understood that some things were worth any risk. The cattle were scattered across a wide area, their panic making coordination impossible. Individual animals stumbled through snow that was already knee-deep on the horses, while others huddled together in groups that the wolves were systematically isolating and attacking. Cash saw one of the Carter calves among a group of yearlings that had been separated from the main herd. The young bull was fighting bravely, trying to protect the injured heifer, but it was only a matter of time before the wolves overwhelmed them both. "Joe," he called, pointing toward the endangered animals. "Your calves." Without hesitation, Joe spurred her horse toward the isolated group, her rifle ready and her face set with determination. Cash followed, knowing that he was watching someone risk everything for the creatures in her care, the same kind of selfless courage that had first attracted him to her. The wolves saw them coming and turned to face this new threat. In the howling wind and driving snow, predators and humans faced each other in a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the cattle, but the future of everyone who had dared to challenge the established order. Cash felt his horse tense beneath him as they approached the wolf pack, the animal's fear warring with years of training and trust. These weren't the mangy scavengers that occasionally threatened isolated calves. These were healthy, desperate predators driven by hunger and the kind of pack intelligence that made them formidable opponents, even for armed humans. "Stay together," he called to Joe, though he could barely hear his own voice above the storm. "Don't let them separate us." The lead wolf, a massive gray male with ice-pale eyes, stood his ground as they approached. Behind him, the rest of the pack fanned out in a formation that spoke of experience and intelligence. They'd done this before. Cash realized used storms and terrain to their advantage. While hunting prey much larger than themselves, Joe's rifle cracked once, then twice, the shots echoing strangely in the muffled air. One of the smaller wolves yelped and limped away, but the others held their positions. They knew that human weapons were limited by ammunition and weather, and they had the patience to wait for their moment. Billy appeared through the snow like a ghost, driving a small group of cattle before him. His young face was flushed with cold and excitement, but his eyes were sharp with the kind of focus that comes from understanding that failure meant death. "Got about a dozen head turned back toward the ranch," he called. "But there's another pack working the eastern slope. We're running out of time." Cash assessed their situation with the calculating mind that had made him successful in business. They'd managed to save some of the cattle, but the main herd was still scattered and vulnerable. The wolves were coordinating their attacks better than expected, and the storm was getting worse rather than better. More critically, the horses were beginning to show signs of exhaustion and hypothermia. Their breath came in great puffs of steam, and ice was forming on their muzzles, despite the protective gear Cash had provided. They had perhaps an hour before the animals would be too cold to function effectively. "We need to make a choice," Cash said, gathering Joe and Billy close enough to hear him clearly. "We can save maybe half the herd if we focus our efforts on the groups closest to shelter. Or we can try to save them all and risk losing everything, including ourselves." Joe looked toward the scattered cattle, her expression torn between practical necessity and the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to risk everything in the first place. Among the distant animals, Cash could see the second Carter calf, a young heifer that represented not just financial investment, but hope for the future. "The smart choice is to save what we can," Joe said finally, her voice heavy with the weight of sacrifice. "But those animals trust us to protect them. How do we live with ourselves if we abandon them?" Billy's response was immediate and passionate. "We don't abandon them. We find a way to save them all." "Billy," Joe started, but her brother cut her off. "No, Joe. I've been thinking about what Pa used to say about doing right versus doing easy. He said that character isn't tested when the choices are simple. It's tested when doing the right thing costs more than you want to pay." Cash found himself studying the young man with growing admiration. At 19, Billy Carter possessed the kind of moral clarity that most people spent lifetimes trying to achieve. More than that, he had the courage to act on his convictions, even when the stakes were life and death. "All right," Cash said finally, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "We save them all, but we do it smart and we do it fast. The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its requirements. They would use the wolves' pack mentality against them, creating a coordinated drive that would push both predators and prey toward the sheltered areas near the ranch buildings. It would require precise timing, absolute trust in each other, and more luck than any of them had a right to expect. Billy, you take the eastern approach and start pushing the scattered groups toward the center. Joe, you and I will work from the west, using noise and movement to herd the wolves away from the cattle. Cash checked his ammunition one final time. We meet at the center point in 30 minutes. If anyone doesn't make it, the others continue with the plan. They separated into the storm, each carrying the knowledge that they might never see each other again. Cash rode beside Joe for as long as their paths allowed, drawing strength from her quiet determination and the way she seemed to find courage in the face of overwhelming odds. "Cash," she called as they prepared to part ways, her voice barely audible. Above the wind, "Whatever happens out there, thank you. For believing in us, for giving us a chance, for becoming the family we never expected to find." He wanted to tell her that she'd given him far more than he'd given her, that she'd shown him what it meant to live for something beyond mere survival. He wanted to say that watching her work with damaged horses had taught him that broken things could heal if they were handled with enough patience and care. Most of all, he wanted to tell her that he'd fallen in love with her courage, her kindness, and the way she'd somehow managed to see past his defenses to the man he'd hidden beneath. Years of careful isolation, but the storm swallowed words as quickly as they could be spoken. So instead, he reached across the space between their horses and squeezed her gloved hand with his own. In that brief contact, he tried to communicate everything he couldn't say, his respect, his admiration, and the growing certainty that his carefully ordered world would be meaningless without her. In it, then they separated into the white chaos. And Cash was alone with his thoughts, and the sound of his horse's labored breathing. The unsigned will in his office seemed like a relic from another life, written by a man who had thought wealth could substitute for connection. Now, riding through a blizzard to save animals that belonged to people he'd grown to love, he understood that true legacy wasn't measured in acres or dollars, but in the lives you touched and the love you dared to give. The wolves howled in the distance, their voices mixing with the wind in a symphony of wildness and danger. But louder than both was the sound of his own heart, finally beating with the rhythm of a man who had something worth fighting for, something worth risking everything to protect. The center point lay ahead through the storm, with 3 people, would either achieve the impossible or face the consequences of daring to care more about principle than safety. Cash spurred his horse forward, carrying with him the hopes and dreams of a family he'd chosen rather than inherited, and the knowledge that some victories were worth any price. Joe's father's lasso hung coiled on her saddle horn, its braided leather worn smooth by generations of carter hands. As she approached the scattered cattle through the blizzard, she could feel the weight of that rope like a lifeline connecting her to everything her family had built and lost and hoped to build again. The tool had belonged to her grandfather, then her father, and now it was hers, a symbol of skill, passed down through bloodlines and the kind of trust that could reach across species to gentle the wildest spirits. The cattle were in full panic. Now, their eyes rolling white with terror as they stumbled through snow that was rapidly becoming too deep for safe movement. Among them, Joe could see both of their precious calves, the young animals that represented not just financial investment, but the foundation of dreams that had sustained her and Billy through the darkest times. The heifer was limping badly, favored, her right front leg in a way that suggested injury from the rocky terrain or a wolf's teeth. But she was still moving, still fighting to stay with the herd that offered her only protection. The young bull had positioned himself between the heifer and the circling wolves, his inexperience balanced by courage that reminded Joe of Billy at his most determined. Her horse fought her guidance as they approached the chaos. The animal's instincts, screaming warnings about venturing closer to predators and panicked prey. But Joe's hands were steady on the reins, her voice calm despite the storm raging around them. Years of working with frightened animals had taught her that confidence could be communicated through touch and tone, that leadership was often just a matter of refusing to let fear make decisions. "Easy, boy," she murmured to her mount, her words barely audible above the wind, but somehow reaching the horse's consciousness. "We've got work to do." The lasso came off her saddle horn with practiced ease, the familiar weight settling into her hands like an extension of her own body. Her father had taught her to rope when she was barely tall enough to hold the coils, and his father had taught him the same way, not as a trick or skill, but as a sacred trust between human and animal that required respect on both sides. First throw was perfect, settling around the neck of a young steer that had broken away from the main group. Joe felt the satisfying resistance as the rope pulled taut, then the gradual yielding as the animal realized it was being guided, rather than captured. Years of patient practice had taught her that roping wasn't about dominance, but about communication, about speaking to an animal's instincts in ways that transcended fear. One by one, she began gathering the scattered cattle, using her rope and high, her voice to convince them that safety lay in the direction she indicated. It was exhausting work in the best of conditions, requiring constant attention to wind direction, animal behavior, and the subtle dynamics of herd psychology. In a blizzard, with wolves circling and visibility reduced to mere yards, it bordered on the impossible. But impossible had never stopped Joe Carter before. She'd learned to walk again after doctors said she might never manage more than a shuffle. She'd rebuilt her life after losing everything to creditors and circumstances beyond her control. She'd taken a chance on a partnership with Wyoming's most emotionally guarded rancher and somehow found her way past defenses that had repelled everyone else for 20 years. The heifer was the most challenging, her injury making her reluctant to move and her fear making her unpredictable. Joe approached slowly, her lasso ready, but her posture non-threatening. The young animal watched her with wide, frightened eyes, torn between the safety of movement and the terror of trusting yet another predator in a world that had suddenly become full of them. "Come on, sweetheart," Joe called softly, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she used with spooked horses. "I know you're hurt, but staying here means dying. Let me help you." The heifer took a tentative step forward, then another. Joe felt her heart lift with hope as the animal began to respond to her guidance. This was why she'd risked everything to work with horses and cattle. These moments when fear gave way to trust, when two different species found a way to communicate across the vast divide of instinct and intelligence. A wolf appeared from the swirling snow like a gray ghost, its pale eyes fixed on the injured heifer with predatory calculation. Joe's rifle was in her scabbard, too far away to reach quickly, and her lasso was already committed to controlling the heifer. For a moment that stretched like eternity, predator and protector faced each other across the white chaos. Then Billy's voice cut through the storm like a blade, his young battle cry mixing with the crack of his rifle as he appeared through the snow, driving a small group of cattle before him. The wolf melted back into the storm, but Joe knew it would return with reinforcements as soon as the opportunity presented itself. "Joe," Billy called, his horse dancing nervously as he fought to control both his mount and the cattle he'd gathered. "Cash is pinned down about a quarter-mile east. 3 wolves have him cornered against the ravine." Joe's blood turned to ice that had nothing to do with the temperature. Cash was in trouble, and she was too far away to help directly. The choice was stark and immediate: continue trying to save the cattle or abandon the rescue to help the man who had risked everything to give them a chance at rebuilding their lives. But it wasn't really a choice at all. Family protected family, regardless of blood relations or legal documents. Cash Mercer had become part of their small circle, had opened his guarded heart enough to let them in. She couldn't save cattle at the cost of losing the man who had shown them what it meant to be valued for who they were rather than what they could provide. "Take the rope," she called to Billy, tossing him the end of her lasso. "Get these animals moving toward the ranch. I'm going after Cash. Joe, no." Billy's voice carried the same protective tone their father had used when she'd announced her intention to ride again after her injury. "It's too dangerous." "Everything's too dangerous today," Joe replied, checking her rifle and spurring her horse toward the eastern slope where Cash was fighting for his life. "But we don't abandon family." She rode into the storm with her father's courage singing in, her blood and her own fierce determination driving her forward. Behind her, Billy's voice rose in encouragement to the cattle he was trying to save, his words mixing with the wind in a melody of hope and desperation. The terrain grew rougher as she climbed toward the ravine, her horse picking its way carefully through snow-covered rocks and hidden obstacles. Each step took them further from safety and deeper into the kind of wilderness where human arrogance meant nothing and only survival skills mattered. The sound of gunfire reached her before she could see its source, the sharp crack of a rifle mixed with snarls, and the kind of sounds that meant a fight for life was in progress. Joe urged her horse faster, knowing that every second counted and that hesitation could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. When she finally spotted Cash through the swirling snow, her heart nearly stopped. He was backed against the edge of the ravine, his horse down and injured, while 3 large wolves circled him with the patient intelligence of experienced killers. His rifle was empty, she could tell from his desperate search for ammunition, and his options had been reduced to a knife and whatever courage he could summon from 20 years of surviving in unforgiving country. Joe's approach was silent, her horse's hooves muffled by the snow and her own breathing controlled by years of hunting experience. The wolves were focused entirely on their cornered prey, confident that their advantage in numbers and terrain made victory inevitable. They had not counted on a limping cowgirl with her father's lasso and a heart full of protective fury. Joe's first shot took the largest wolf cleanly, her rifle singing its deadly song across the white silence. The remaining 2 wolves spun toward this new threat, their predatory calculations suddenly complicated by the presence of another armed human. But Joe Carter had learned patience from working with frightened horses, had learned precision from her father's careful teaching, and had learned courage from refusing to let her injury define her limitations. As the wolves charged through the snow toward her position, she was already moving, her rifle ready and her heart steady with the knowledge that she was fighting for something more important than her own survival. She was fighting for love, for family, and for the future that she and Cash and Billy were building together in the harsh but beautiful landscape of Wyoming territory. The storm raged around them, but Joe had found her center in the eye of chaos, and nothing, not wolves, not weather, not the accumulated weight of all their enemies, was going to take that away from her. The simple gold wedding band had belonged to Cash's mother, hidden away in his desk drawer for 18 years, like a promise he'd never expected to make. As he pressed his back against the rocky wall of the ravine, watching Joe fight for both, their lives with a courage that took his breath away, Cash finally understood why he'd been unable to throw the ring away or sell it. With his mother's other belongings, he'd been waiting for the right woman to give it to Joe's second shot echoed across the canyon, and another wolf fell, its gray form disappearing into the snow-covered rocks below. But the third wolf, the largest and most cunning of the pack, had learned from watching its companions die. Instead of charging directly into Joe's rifle sights, it began circling, using the storm and terrain to mask its approach. Cash struggled to reload his rifle with hands that were growing numb from cold and blood loss. The fall that had killed his horse had left him with a gash across his forehead and a twisted ankle that would make escape difficult even if they managed to survive the next few minutes. But physical pain seemed secondary to the realization that he was about to watch the woman he loved risk her life to save his. "Joe," he called through the wind, his voice carrying both warning and something deeper. "The big one's trying to flank you." She heard him, her head turning just enough to track the movement he'd spotted. Her horse danced nervously beneath her, sensing the presence of a predator it couldn't see, but definitely could smell. Joe's rifle swung in a smooth arc, following instincts honed by years of hunting in country where mistakes were measured in lives rather than missed opportunities. The wolf burst from behind a snow-covered boulder with the silence of a shadow and the speed of desperation. It was magnificent in its wild fury, a creature perfectly adapted to this harsh landscape and completely committed to the kill. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and protector faced each other across the white chaos. Joe's rifle spoke once more, the shot echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The wolf stumbled, wounded but not stopped, its momentum carrying it forward in a leap that would bring it within reach of both horse and rider. Cash watched in horror as the injured predator's claws extended toward Joe's leg, the same leg that had been broken by a bronc and mended through sheer determination. But Joe Carter had learned more than patience from working with frightened animals. She'd learned timing and balance, and the kind of fluid movement that could turn apparent weakness into unexpected strength. As the wolf's leap reached its apex, she threw herself sideways in the saddle, using her injured leg as a pivot point to swing her entire body out of the predator's path. The wolf's claws raked empty air where she'd been a split second before, and its momentum carried it past her horse and into the snow beyond. Before it could recover, Joe's boot connected with its wounded flank, sending it tumbling toward the edge of the ravine where Cash waited with his reloaded rifle. The final shot was his, clean and merciful, ending the wolf's suffering and the immediate threat to their lives. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the wind and their own labored breathing, Cash and Joe looked at each other across the blood-spattered snow with the shared understanding of people who had faced death together and emerged victorious. "Your ankle," Joe said, dismounting carefully and making her way toward him through the drifts. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," Cash admitted, accepting her support as he struggled to stand. "But not as bad as it would have been if you hadn't shown up when you did." They were close now, closer than they'd ever been, and Cash could see the concern in her sage-colored eyes mixing with something warmer and more complex. The storm still raged around them, but somehow the space between their bodies felt sheltered and safe. "Joe," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of everything he'd been afraid to say until this moment, when death had stripped away pretense and left only truth. "I need you to know." "I know," she replied softly, her gloved hand touching his cheek with infinite gentleness. "I've known for weeks, Cash. The question is what we're going to do about it." The kiss that followed was tentative at first, the careful exploration of two people who had learned that trust was a precious commodity not to be wasted. But as the wind howled around them and the snow continued to fall, their embrace deepened into something that spoke of shared trials and mutual recognition of souls that had found their match. When they finally broke apart, Cash rested his forehead against hers, his breath mixing with hers in small clouds of warmth that seemed to defy the bitter cold surrounding them. "Marry me," he said, the words coming out in a rush before he could overthink them into silence. "I know it's crazy, I know. We've only known each other for a few months. But Joe, I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore." Joe's smile was radiant, despite the exhaustion and stress of the day's trials. "Cash Mercer, are you proposing to me in the middle of a blizzard while we're surrounded by dead wolves?" "I guess I am," he replied, his own smile breaking through, despite the absurdity of their circumstances. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," Joe confirmed, sealing the promise with another kiss that somehow managed to warm them both, despite the Arctic conditions. Their celebration was interrupted by the sound of Billy's voice calling through the storm, his young tenor carrying notes of worry and hope in equal measure. They separated reluctantly, the practical demands of survival reasserting themselves over the emotional breakthrough they'd just shared. "Over here," Cash called back, his voice carrying farther than he'd expected in the thin air. Billy appeared through the snow like a cavalry scout, his face flushed with cold and excitement. Behind him, barely visible through the storm, came the shapes of cattle moving steadily toward shelter, the fruits of their dangerous gamble finally paying off. "Got most of them turned around," Billy reported breathlessly. "Both our calves are safe, plus about 30 head of Mr. Mercer's stock. The rest scattered too far to follow, but we saved the majority." Cash felt a surge of relief that had nothing to do with financial calculations and everything to do with watching a young man succeed at something that mattered deeply to him. Billy had proved himself today in ways that would serve him well for the rest of his life, had shown the kind of courage and competence that marked natural leaders. "You did good, Billy," Cash said simply, but the words carried weight that the young man would remember for decades to come. As they made their way back toward the ranch, Cash riding double behind Joe while Billy managed the cattle, the storm began to show signs of weakening. The wind still howled, but with less fury than before, and the snow had changed from horizontal sheets to more manageable vertical flakes. More importantly, the three of them had changed as well. They'd faced a crisis that could have destroyed everything they'd worked for, and they'd emerged not just victorious, but transformed. The shared danger had burned away the last barriers between them, creating bonds that would withstand whatever challenges the future might bring. Cash's mother's ring felt warm in his pocket, no longer a relic of loss, but a symbol of hope renewed. The unsigned will on his desk would need revision, but that was a happy problem, the problem of a man who had finally found people worthy of his legacy and his love. Behind them, the wolves lay silent in the snow, their threat ended, but their wildness somehow honored by the courage it had taken to face them. Ahead lay warmth, safety, and the beginning of a partnership that would become legend in the territory, the story of how a cold-hearted cattle baron learned to love again because a limping cowgirl had the patience to gentle his frozen heart. Storm was ending, but their real adventure was just beginning. In the growing darkness, the lights of the Mercer Ranch beckoned like a promise of home, family, and the kind of love that could survive anything Wyoming's harsh country could throw at it. The new ranch sign stood proud against the spring sky, its fresh paint gleaming in the morning sun. Mercer Carter Ranch, spelled out in bold letters that could be seen from the main road. Cash stood beside it with his arm around Joe's waist, both of them watching Billy direct the installation with the enthusiasm of a young man who had finally found his place in the world. 6 months had passed since the blizzard that had changed everything. 6 months of legal battles, wedding preparations, and the slow, satisfying work of building a life together. The foreclosure notice that had threatened to destroy their dreams lay forgotten in a lawyer's file, defeated by evidence of Dr. Morrison's illegal debt, collection practices that had freed dozens of families from financial bondage. Joe's hand rested on her still flat belly, where the first sign of their child grew beneath her heart. They hadn't told Billy yet, wanting to be certain before sharing news that would make their family complete in ways they'd never dared imagine. But the secret added sweetness to every shared glance, every casual touch, every moment of quiet contentment. In their transformed world, "Think it's straight?" Billy called from his position near the signpost, his face bright with the kind of joy that came from meaningful work done well. "Looks perfect from here," Cash replied, his voice carrying the warm authority of a man who had learned to balance strength with gentleness. The harsh edges that had once defined him had been worn smooth by love and partnership. Leaving behind someone who commanded respect through competence rather than fear, the ranch itself had been transformed as well, though the changes were subtle, enough that a casual observer might miss them. The horse corrals had been expanded to accommodate Joe's growing reputation as the territory's finest horse trainer. The cattle operation had been streamlined to focus on quality breeding stock rather than sheer numbers. Most importantly, the ranch house itself had been filled with the sounds and scents of an active family. Joe's mother's rocking chair had been moved back to the kitchen, where it belonged, and where Joe now spent her evenings planning their future, while Cash read aloud from agricultural journals and Billy sketched designs for improvements to their operation. The chair no longer symbolized loss but continuity, the passing of love and wisdom from one generation to the next. The partnership with the Henderson property had exceeded all their expectations. Billy had proved himself a natural cattleman, developing breeding programs that were already attracting attention from ranchers across the territory. More importantly, he'd grown into the kind of man his father would have been proud of: strong, principled, and generous with both his time and his affections. "Remember when you told me that some hearts limp but keep walking?" Cash said quietly, his words meant only for Joe's ears. "I remember," she replied, leaning into his warmth and thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I think I understand now what you meant. It's not about hiding the damage or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about learning to move forward despite it, finding strength in places you didn't know existed." Joe smiled, her sage-colored eyes bright with the kind of happiness that comes from being truly seen and valued by another person. "My pa used to say that the strongest horses were often the ones that had been broken and learned to trust again. Same principle applies to people, I think." They watched Billy secure the final brace on their sign, his movements confident and sure. At 20, he had grown into his potential in ways that promised great things for their shared future. The calves that had once represented their only hope for financial recovery had grown into prime breeding stock, their offspring already showing the quality that would make the Mercer Carter Ranch famous throughout the territory. "Mails here," called Tom Bradley from the direction of the main road, his weathered face creased with a kind of smile that had become common since the ranch had been transformed from a business operation into a true family enterprise. The letter he carried bore the seal of the territorial government, its official appearance causing a moment of concern before Cash opened it and read the contents aloud. It was a formal invitation to serve as delegates to the upcoming statehood convention. Recognition of their growing influence in territorial affairs and their reputation for fair dealing in difficult situations. "They want both of us," Cash said with amazement, looking between the invitation and his wife. "The letter specifically mentions your work with horse training and your reputation for integrity in business dealings." Joe felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with the acknowledgement that their partnership had become something larger than either of them could have achieved alone. They'd built more than a successful ranch. They'd created a model for how people could work together across differences of background and experience. "What do you think?" Cash asked, his tone making it clear that the decision would be made together, as all their important choices had been since that night in the blizzard when they promised to face whatever came as partners. "I think," Joe said slowly, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly, "that we have something to contribute to the conversation about Wyoming's future. And I think our child should grow up in a state built on principles of fairness and mutual respect." Billy looked up from his work, having caught enough of their conversation to understand its significance. "You're going to help write the state constitution?" "We're going to try," Cash replied, his arm tightening around Joe's waist in a gesture that spoke of shared purpose and unshakable commitment. As the day wore on, neighbors began arriving to celebrate the completion of their sign and the news of their appointment as delegates. The Mercer Carter Ranch had become a gathering place for the community, a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over competition. when they valued character over convenience. The sun was setting when the last of their guests departed, leaving the three of them alone with their thoughts and their plans for the future. The evening air carried the scent of new grass and wildflowers, the sounds of cattle settling for the night, and the promise of another day in a life built on love, mutual respect, and the kind of partnership that made any challenge manageable. Jo sat in her mother's rocking chair, her hands busy with mending, while Cash and Billy discussed plans for expanding their breeding program. The domestic scene was exactly what she'd dreamed of during the darkest days after her injury, when the future had seemed as uncertain as Wyoming weather. "Time for evening prayers," Billy said, reaching for their father's Bible with the reverence he'd never lost, despite all the changes in their circumstances. As he read from Ecclesiastes, his voice steady and sure, Jo felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter so faint she might have imagined it except for the certainty in her heart. That new life was indeed growing within her. She caught Cash's eye and smiled, and his answering expression told her that he'd somehow sensed the change as well. "To everything there is a season," Billy read, "and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted." The words seemed especially meaningful tonight, surrounded by the evidence of lives rebuilt and dreams reclaimed. They'd survived their season of loss and struggle, had planted new hopes in the fertile ground of mutual respect and shared purpose. Now came the time of harvest, of reaping the rewards that came from refusing to let hardship define the boundaries of possibility. Outside their windows, the Wyoming range stretched endlessly under a sky full of stars, beautiful and harsh and full of promise for those brave enough to claim it. The Mercer Carter Ranch stood as proof that some dreams were worth any sacrifice, that some partnerships could survive any test, and that love, real, patient, enduring love, could indeed transform the coldest heart into something capable of warmth, generosity, and joy. The rocking chair moved gently back and forth, keeping time with the rhythm of a heart, no longer frozen, but flowing freely with the kind of love that would sustain them through whatever seasons lay ahead. In the growing darkness, their home glowed with light and laughter, a beacon of hope in a landscape that had taught them both the price of dreams and the value of holding fast to what truly mattered. Their story had begun with a cold-hearted cowboy and a limping cowgirl who had somehow found the courage to trust each other despite all the reasons not to. It was ending with a family, a legacy, and the promise that some hearts, once properly healed, could indeed keep walking together through whatever paths the future might reveal.